Record on this computer. I'm going to have to give you an apple.
There you go.
I turned it on and I just forget. Did I bring my glasses? Yeah. That's the same way with them, bringing glasses. In Ferguson's book, he deals with this idea about the governors and so forth, and I'm going to read what he wrote on pages 43 and 44. It's not a lot. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences. He talks about, he says, the provincial governor that had the title of proconsul, Acts 19:38. That is, in the place of council or functioning with the power of a consul in that province, which was originally a sphere of authority and later geographical term. The proconsuls were chosen by lot out of the former magistrates at Rome. The emperor could manipulate this process in various ways, for of course he could not be indifferent to the persons who qualified for such important positions. I think he's being sarcastic there, but the thing of it is that there's a number of things that are said about these in his book that are not said in this book, and sometimes it's a duplicate. But we need to understand about these proconsul and the governors, and the reason for it is because the position that they play in our studies of the New Testament. The Roman Empire, as we look at the empire, was divided into territories, and those territories are called provinces. And so most of them had been acquired after 240 BC. And so few had dropped into the Romans' lap, as we would probably say. The province of Asia, covering the northwestern portion of what we call Turkey today, had been willed to the Romans by its last king, and the last king died in 133 BC. So he had willed actually that land over to the Roman government, and there were a few others that were technically called kingdoms. But the emperor retained direct control of the frontier provinces, such like Gaul and Syria. Now, we think about Syria today, then the emperors they would retain the control. But troops were stationed there, and the Senate chose the governors of certain of those provinces, such as Asia and Cilicia, or Sicily, which had been long pacified, and so they could change the territory status, and they did that for Judah. Matter of fact, the idea is if the Romans became dissatisfied with the behavior of its populace or its ruler, they could change the status. And now we have to remember that, because when we get down to different things like the birth of Christ, that type of thing, and the taxation, and then the dealings with Jesus, those 3.5 years that they're actually dealing with him and how he's dealt with, we have to realize that what's standing behind Pilate and all these others is that their territory can change. They can change it. Not only that, they can take it away and give it to somebody else. So there was a lot of pressure upon, no matter what ruler they were and how they ruled, what level they were on, they had pressure upon them to rule and don't cause any problems for Rome. That's what, if you always remember, or ask yourself the question when you're reading, and it's talking about what the government is involved with, either Jesus or the apostles, as you read the New Testament, you just stop and you think, in reference to what's going on with them, if they're messing around with the Roman people or the Roman government, that the person that's in authority, there's this idea of great pressure on him because he could lose his territory. Now, Augustus, he kept, during his reign, Augustus Caesar, he kept his own control on all the stronger province, which could not be safely as easily governed by the magistrates. And so the rest, he actually gave over to the proconsuls, and they were chosen by lot. Now, from time to time, though, Augustus changed some of the province from the imperial category to the senatorial. Or he'd take the senatorial and change them over to the imperial. It's just according to how things were working. And they didn't, these Caesars, the very top man, did not like to have problems in his provinces. And so you never wanted to be over one of the provinces and all of a sudden get instructions, you need to come to Rome. Okay? Because you may go to Rome, but you're not going to leave Rome. Okay, and so most of them didn't show up. Most of them killed themselves because they knew what was coming. Now, a proconsul is a man who has held the highest office in Rome, the consulship they call it. And so each year around 200 BC, the Senate, the Roman Senate, assigned governorships by lot to the available pool of former consuls. And so by allowing the Senate to select the governors, the quieter provinces, the emperors maintained the function or fiction of a republic and rewarded men who had made their way up the bureaucratic ladder, as we would say. And so most of the aristocratic Romans regarded this task as a necessary evil with some degree of getting prestige attached. So they would try to do everything they possibly could to please the emperor. And so some like Cicero actively resented it because it took him away from Rome for about a year or more. Occasionally, a man who had held the second highest office in the state, the praetorship, would be sent to one of the smaller provinces if a proconsul was not available, meaning not available, he's been replaced. And so they hadn't got anybody to replace him, so they would send the next man in Rome down there. So he would be called a propraetor and would have all the powers of a governor. And so those powers will be discussed, we can discuss them later on. But under the principality of the provinces on the frontiers where armies were stations, all of those were controlled by the emperor. Now, we understand that. Well, we ought to. Just notice that if they had soldiers there, the emperor was in charge. Okay? And so when we read later on, if we were to discuss, when we discuss all of the Caesars, if we were to discuss their happenings in the New Testament, and looking at the history that we know in reference to them, then we would find out that these Caesars, because they were in charge of the armies, how they were doing, just as soon as a Caesar would die and the other Caesar would take over, sometimes they would send their armies to certain different places, like especially among Titus and Vespasian and Titus later on in the Roman history. So they had to, we need to remember that they controlled them. They covered them all as proconsul and sent out deputies known as legates, Legates, or procurators, sometimes called prefects. Now, perfect is P-E-R, and prefects is P-R-E. I thought that was every time I would run spell check, it would show up as a misspelled word. So prefects is what they're called. And that's why in smaller provinces. And so to administrate for them, the term governor is a general one that can be applied to any head of a province. So as the supreme proconsul, the emperor retained the right to intervene in the affairs of any province. In other words, he was still over every governor. And so the system of this administration was devised by that of Augustus Caesar. And he remained in effect. They only changed some minor things, refinements as they would go along, but it started breaking down in around the 3rd century AD. And so the provinces did benefit from the peacefulness of Roman rule, but they had to pay a price. There's, peace always comes with a price, they say. And so they had to pay a price. The Romans collected tribute. Now, this is important when we study the Bible. The Romans would collect tribute from all the provinces. No one was exempt, okay? And usually through a method called tax farming. And so wealthy men in Rome, people engaged in public businesses, they were called publican, ends in I, publican with the N, with the ends with an I. But they bought the contracts, okay? They would buy the contracts, giving them the right to collect the taxes in the area. And the amount to be equal to what they had paid the government plus interest, that's usually about 25%. And so this system allowed the government to collect its opening expenses each year without effort. So the original contractors, though, then subcontracted the collection rights, divided them into smaller segments of the territory. The subcontractors could collect their investment plan plus interest, So obviously, this, quote, pyramid scheme, that's what it is, soon became enormously expensive to the provinces, and it explains why Matthew and Zacchaeus were despised by their citizens. Because it got expensive. Not only were they Jews working for the conquerors, but they were extorting large sums of money with Rome's power to back them up. So the government had to back these collectors if they expected them to bid for contracts in later years. They stood fast for those people, these wealthy men in Rome that's engaged in this public business. And so, but Matthew and Zacchaeus were despised because of that. There's a lot of information in both books about Rome and about Judea. It's actually too much for me to read from Brother Everett's book, but there are a number of little things. On page 165, 173, again, you can find his books also sometimes online pretty reasonable. He talks about the ancient religion, and we're going to talk about that. Let me see here. I think there's something that I marked. If I didn't mark it, then I'm not going to read from not them pages. 180, 183. Sometimes when I was reading some of these, and I read, and so he says the same thing, so I did not mark them. Okay. Let me run over here right quick. 411. Okay. We won't read that part. That comes later, too. But when we talk about Rome and Judea, now, like I said a while ago, Judea, made up of the Jewish people, even though Rome's presence is there, they were the ones that had a problem with Rome. In other words, Rome had a problem with the Jews. They wanted the Jews to be quiet. And they didn't want any uprising. But now you got to stop again. We've already studied about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Essenes, and all them other isms. Okay? But also amongst all that mix was this group of people that was leaving Judaism, called Christians, and they were bringing Jewish people and Gentile people into this one, what they would call a cult, Christians. And this group of Christians, because of what they were doing, they were really causing a problem among the Jewish people. Okay? And so basically Rome thought of the Christian people same as they thought about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and all the others. Okay? And so this was a problem. Now, according to 1 Maccabees chapter 8, Judas Maccabeus formed an alliance with Rome to give him some leverage against the Seleucid kings of Israel. And so the Romans have been trying for a generation before that to maintain a balanced power in the Eastern Mediterranean between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So this effort to weaken Syria in some way fits with what we know of their policy in the region. The Romans sent no troops to the area at that time. But in 63 BC, a man by the name of Pompey. Now, Pompey is not counted as one of the Caesars. Okay? Julius is counted as one of the Caesars. And so that tells us there's 10 of them. You don't count Pompey. Pompey arrived in Judea toward the end of a campaign during which he had conquered all the new territories in the east and reasserted Romans control over several other areas. And so Judah at that time was ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty, and that is, these are descendants of the Maccabees. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, were engaged in a civil war, which Pompey settled by siding with Hyrcanus. And he allowed Hyrcanus to retain the title of high priest, but stripped him of the title of king and limited his jurisdiction to Judah and the Dumena. And that is I forget what they call that, another name for it. It's another name for Dumena. Which the Ethnarch, ruler of the people, that's what he was there. Hyrcanus was the ethnarch, ruler of people. Now, while he was in Jerusalem, though, Pompey entered into the Holy of Holies. And the only person supposed to go in the Holy of Holies is the high priest. laying the groundwork for enmity and misunderstanding between the Romans and the Jews, which persisted for centuries. So there was this great resentment now because from the Jewish people toward the Romans because of what Pompey did. Now, he was kind of surprised, though, that when he went in, that it was empty. And so a persistent legend held that the Jews worshiped the head of a donkey because that animal had supposedly led them to water during their expulsion from that of Egypt. So the story may reflect some awareness about illiterate Romans, of stories such as the one about Moses striking a rock with his staff and causing water to flow out of it in Exodus chapter 17. But we should note that a Roman view of Judaism. Now here, this is what the Romans actually thought of. Let me get all the way down so I can read. This is from Thucydides and his Histories, chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. He says, now this is their view of Judaism. Many sources agree that a plague, now this is this historian writing now during the time. Many sources agree that a plague which disfigured the body broke out in Egypt. King Bocharus consulted the oracle of Ammon to find a remedy and was ordered to cleanse his kingdom by carrying this race, so hated by the gods, into another land. The people, hunted out and herded together, were dumped in a desert. As the others sat stunned and weeping, one of the exiles, Moses, advised them not to look for help from the gods or for men, for they had been abandoned by both. They should take as their divine leader the one who will first help them overcome their present misery. After a journey of 6 consecutive days, on the 7th day, they took over a country. Driving out the inhabitants, founded a city and a temple. In order to strengthen his control over this nation of posterity, Moses established new rituals contrary to those of all peoples. They considered profane those things which we hold sacred. Yet they allowed things which are forbidden among us. This form of worship, however, is supported by its antiquity. There are other traditions which are perverse and debased, gain their strength from their very badness. That's what he says about that's his view. That's the Roman view of the Jewish people. Okay, now Aristobulus and his sons continued to make trouble. And so, with the result that between 57 to 55 BC, the Romans deprived Hyrcanus entirely his civil powers and put Judea under the control of the governor of Syria. Now, the civil wars raging in Rome made it difficult at that time for the Romans to devote much attention to what was taking place, because this to them was one of the minor provinces on the very edge of their empire, so they weren't all that concerned, it would seem, or because they were busy doing other stuff. There was an opportunity for, though, an ambitious man to carve out a place for himself. So one of Hyrcanus's strongest backers was a man by the name of Antipater, governor of Idumea. And he had 2 sons, Phasael, and get this one, Herod. And so they displayed an uncanny knack of sensing which way the political winds were blowing. In other words, they were the lucky ones. So somewhere around about 48 BC, Antipater sent assistance to Julius Caesar, who was besieged in Alexandria. And while his troops were there, Caesar was able to break out of the trap. And in return for the favor that Caesar had restored the title of the etharch to Hyrcanus and appointed Herod and Phasael tetrarchs. But a few years later, when Caesar's assassin, Cassius, who had commanded for several eastern provinces at that time, demanded tribute from Judea, Antipater paid. Now, in the late 40s of BC, saw again some more turmoil all of a sudden again in Judea. Now, Antipater in 43 BC was murdered. And so Parthian invasion in 40 resulted in Aristobulus' son being proclaimed ruler of Jerusalem, with Hyrcanus taken captive and carried to Mesopotamia. Now, Antipater's sons, now remember, those 2 sons, Phasca and Herod, because of what was taking place, Phasael committed suicide. See, because they're going to kill him anyway. But Herod He escaped to Rome. A few years later, he returned to Judea as king, appointed by Mark Antony, Caesar's former lieutenant. So that's how we get up with the Herods. Okay, he's Idumean. Now, we'll find that sometimes it's referred that in reference to the Herods that they knew a lot about the Jewish people. And they did, because go all the way back, they were family. And so he returned there, and a few of their territories gave the Romans as much trouble or as little benefit as Judea. Now, a man by the name of H.A.M. Jones, what he says in reference to Judea at this time is the classic instance of intractable area. So many Jews were excused from paying taxes because of favors, mainly loans done for Julius Caesar, and became of the military assistance with Antipater. So Herod's father had given Caesar in Alexandria, Jews across the empire, at least those strictly observant, had their taxes reduced by the amounts that they had sent to Jerusalem each year for maintenance of the temple. And so Judah produced nothing of any particular economical value at all, and was constantly on the verge of revolt. In other words, there's always uprisings there. So in trying to govern it, the Romans changed its status from a kingdom, there they go again, back to a providence, and back to a kingdom. So they divided it several ways, and alternatively gave it to and opposed Jewish demands. Nothing they did seem to make much difference what they did, if it was a providence or if it was a kingdom. It didn't really matter. And so this brought us to our discussion now about the Herodian family. Okay? Let's see. In his book, Brother Ferguson, he talks about this family on page 413 and 414. Now, he talks about Herod the Great. And now Herod the Great was from 34 to 4 BC. Now, to get the 4 BC part now. Remember the Herod there that's involved in the birth of Christ. And so he flees to Rome. Herod was declared king at 40 BC by the Senate. Not so easy task of actually winning his kingdom was accomplished in 37 BC. He persuaded Anthony to put Antiochus out of the way. He was bound to a cross and flogged, a punishment no other king had suffered at the hands of the Romans, and then killed. Although Herod was officially friend and ally of the Roman people, as a client king, he was bound to carry out the will of Rome. So Herod proved to be an able king. And Herod had many Gentile subjects as well. Let me go back up one. The rabbis paid tribute to Herod's work by saying, he who had not seen Herod's temple had not seen beauty. Herod had many Gentile subjects as well, and he built temples and other structures for them too. He also built a theater, an amphitheater in Jerusalem, and on the side of Stratos Tower, he built the city of Caesarea at the port of entry to his realm. And so, although Herod was a Jew by religion, his racial descent was Edomite, Idumean, Edomite. That's I couldn't think of that a while ago. And in spite of his efforts to appease the Jews, he was never popular. Jewish hostility expressed in almost contemporary the assumption of Moses. Among his wives was a Hasmonean princess, Mary Anne, granddaughter of both Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Not only was this marriage political advantages for legitimating his position in the eyes of Jews, he also seemed to have a strong affection for her. So there was constant friction between Idumean, or the Edomites, and the Hasmonean branch of his family. So that was about Herod. So he knows about the Jewish religion. And so at the time of the birth of Christ, he being this client king, being that of Herod the Great. And so when we turn over to like Matthew 1 and Matthew 2 and so forth, he mentions Herod there. We're talking about Herod the Great. So after leaping that political fence, as we would probably call it, to Octavian's side in 31 BC, he managed to retain his kingdom. Now, Perhaps, though, because of what was taking place among the Caesars and so forth, the still uprisings and so on that's taking place at that time. Herod, he managed to keep his kingdom, but it may have been that there was just simply no strong candidate to replace Herod, or because Octavian knew that Herod would be grateful to escape with his life, and he would forever be under the Romans' thumb. So he remained loyal to Rome for the rest of his reign, even sending his members of his family to the capital as hostages. And so they were probably safer there than they were in Judea. Okay? They were in Judea, and he thought they was a threat to him, then he'd have them killed. So considering how many of his wives and children he had already murdered. So Augustus supposedly observed that it would be better to be Herod's pig than a member of his family, since as a Jew, Herod would not kill or eat a pig. So Josephus discusses the family of Herod, and in the book, over in appendix number 2, he tries some type of attempt for genealogy, okay? And I looked at that, and I looked at it. I just put it that way, and I just said, well, we won't talk about that. It's hard enough for me to trace my own genealogy, you know. So I wasn't going to mess with that. So if you get the book, it's in the appendix 2 there. It talks about the genealogy of that of Herod's family. But Herod tried all of his life to gain acceptance in the eyes of the Jews. Now, he was an Idumean by birth, one of those allegedly descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's son of Hagar. To Orthodox Jews, Idumean was half-breeds, and their resentment was basically fueled by having one of them appointed by an outsider as their king. That was just about too much for them. And even again, his marriage to that of the daughter of Hyrcanus did little to legitimize his position in the eyes of all of the people. And so they gave him little credit for his considerable achievements. He did achieve a lot. Again, he rebuilt the harbor at Caesarea, and it was named in honor of a ruling Roman family, and expanded and refurbished the temple at Jerusalem. And so they seem much more aware of his savagery toward his family and shed no tears at his death in 4 BC. But he did do some things for them. And you would think that they would be, a little more gracious than they were. But Herod's kingdom then, because of his death, was divided. And so now he had 3 surviving sons, Antipas, Archelaus, and Philip. And those sons would become an ethnarch. So Philip's domain consisted of several territories east of that of the Jordan River. And that's mentioned in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Since we're doing the New Testament, we'll look over there. He says there, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judah, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch, Iturea, and he says the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanas, the tetrarch of Abilene, and Annas and Caius being the high priest. The word of God came unto John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. Now, if you were to take the time, you could look up all the dates of all those people, and it would be interesting. But Antipas was given Galilee and Perea in Mark chapter 3 and verse 8, beyond the Jordan, while Archelaus was given governor to Judea and Samaria and Idumea. Now, that's really something, because he's got Judea, and we've already talked some about the Samaritans. We had a little thing about, we mentioned the Pharisees, Sadducees, but we also brought up the Samaritans and their way of worship of things, and therefore they were also descendants of Abraham through Abraham. So you have that, you have the Jews, you have the Samaritans, and you have the Edomites. Again, all of this is involved. It's basically, as we would stop for a moment, think about that as family. So Archelaus ruled so brutally that his subjects finally begged Augustus to rescue them from his tyranny. And so in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 22, this situation was behind Joseph's decision to avoid Judea while Archelaus was in power. And so Archelaus was disposed from office, and he was banned around AD 86, banished to Gaul. And so the territory that he had ruled was converted into that of the Roman province under a prefect appointed directly by the emperor. So here's the Herodian family. They continued, though, to have their supporters, however, who worked for the restoration of one of the descendants to that of the throne. and may even have been messianic implications in their effort. So you still had them. And then we were introduced, and there are other people, but Mr. Bale just picks up on a few of them, a man by the name of Pilate. Okay? Now, the Bible talks about him. Jesus' advice is, he says, give the emperor the things that are the emperor's. In other words, you give tribute to Caesar. Remember that in Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Well, under Augustus and Tiberius, relationships between that of Rome and the Jews were kind of stable, if not really friendly. So it may have been because of what Jesus said there. You know, whose image is on the coin? Well, it's Caesar, therefore you contribute, you give tribute there. And so it reflects an attitude that could have been prevalent only in the early part of the first century AD, when Rome seldom interfered directly in the Jewish affairs. Like I said, they basically left the Jews alone unless there was a problem. And so Thucydides says of the province that under Tiberius all was quiet, which isn't exactly the picture one gets when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Augustus believed in changing governors every couple of years. It's kind of like preachers, you know, they change pulpits every couple of years. Some of them do. That's not everybody now. Tiberius, on the other hand, left governors in office for a long term. And there were some motives that were attributed to his decisions. You know, Pilate was a prefect, and he was a prefect from 26 to, some say 36, some say 37 AD. And so, but throughout his tenure, he was a source of irritation to the Jews. And we see that. Mm-hmm. He actually typified the Roman approach to dealing with foreign people. He understood virtually nothing about the Jews. He didn't understand about their faith or their devotion to, and simply forged ahead doing things the Roman way. You know, when I was in the military, that is, when I was in Vietnam, we would have new lieutenants come in, first sergeants too. But we'd have, not first sergeant didn't bother us. They stayed back most of the time. But we'd have new lieutenants come in, and we'd have to finally just set them down and say, look, the Army book way doesn't work here. You need to understand that. You know, we're trying to be nice, but you need to understand. Well, you know, we had a couple of them that just didn't see that. And one of them was our platoon leader for about 2 weeks, and the company commander sent him to another platoon because he left us all killed. And because he wouldn't listen. He was gun-ho. He was like John Wayne, you know. And so we need to realize that here is Pilate. He's not listening. You know, I mean, all he had to do was really listen to the Jewish people. And the Jewish people probably said, look, we pay tribute to Caesar. We do all that we can to please Rome, as long as y'all leave us alone. You know, but Pilate didn't do that. Now, Josephus tells us that Pilate arrived in Jerusalem at night and sneaked into his soldiers' legendary standards into the city under cover of darkness. Now, this outraged the Jews because the standards had animal figures or images of the emperor on them and were worshipped as minor divinities by the soldiers in violation of Exodus 20, verses 4 through 6. Now, notice that now. Now, all of a sudden, you got something Rome versus Jews. So the people protested for several days, and they were demanding that Pilate remove the standards. And so when he threatened to have his soldiers lop their heads off, they bared their necks, declaring that they would rather die than live with pagan idols polluting their city. The Romans were polytheists. They worshiped as many gods as they chose to worship. And so no Roman had ever showed such strong religious beliefs that he was willing to die for one of those little G gods rather than risk a bloodbath in his first week as governor. The astonished Pilate yielded to the Jews' demand and removed them, which, you know, if he had not, that would have caused a big uprising, and guess what would happen to Mr. Pilate? Somebody from Rome would be visiting him soon. That's just the way it worked. Or he would be called to Rome, but he would never make it to Rome if he's called to Rome, because he'd take his life. That's what they did. In another controversy, though, to show that he didn't get along with the Jews, he used funds from the Jewish temple, Mark 7 and verse 11, to finance a construction of his. When a mob arrived before his residence to protest, Pilate had his soldiers beat them with clubs. So a number of the people died in ensuing panic, and it's little wonder that the Jews complained of Pilate as inflexible, merciless, and obstinate. And seeing the problems that Pilate had already encountered with the Jews enables us to appreciate the dread with which he must have heard their request that he put Jesus to death. Here was another difficult situation for him. And he seems to have caved into avoiding offending the Jews any further. So there is a persistent legend in the early church that he informed Tiberius about Jesus. There's a document. Well, everybody looks at the document and says, you know, it's really not true. It's unfounded, even to the point where he drops out of sight at the time of Tiberius' death. Pilate does, and it said that he committed suicide, but there's no history about that at all. So that's Pilate. Maybe it'll help us to understand the reason why he gave in reference to that of the crucifixion, because he had so many run-ins with the Jewish people. And again, there's that great pressure upon him. He has to perform. He has to keep them quiet. He has to make everybody get along. But he had this bad thing about feelings about that of foreign people. Then you have the Apostle Paul and the Romans. And probably we read more about Paul in reference to the Roman, his dealings with the Roman folks. Let's see here, page. I'll come back to that. It's no use in reading it twice, so we'll just come back. But he, in his book on Ferguson on page 165 and 419 and 20, talks about the Romans and some with the Apostle Paul. But other Roman officials of varying ranks appeared in the pages of the New Testament. Most of them crossed the path of Paul. Now, some ask the question whether high-ranking Romans had any contact with Christianity. And this is what they say. And Bale puts this in there. He says Luke, they argue, was trying to present the new religion as acceptable to the right people. Luke was writing by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. There is no leaning one way or the other. He is just giving things in the order in which the Holy Spirit reveals them to him. Now, Pliny, the younger, the historian, he has a letter about the Christians in Bithynia. And he reports that many people of every age rank, both men and women, were members of the group, talking about the church now. Pliny was certainly trying not to make his wretched superstition appear respectable in the eyes of the emperor. So we ought to give credits to his account and be more willing to believe what Luke said as well. Luke was just reporting what the Holy Spirit told him to record. Now, one of the persons that we're going to come in contact with is found over in Acts chapter 13 and verse 12. When we would find that as we look there, that the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, verse 1, Barnabas and Simon and Niger, Lucius, and Cyrenius, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod, the tetrarch, and Saul. Okay? But if you go down through there, verse 13, what did I say? Okay, that's not the verse. Yeah, that's the verse. You have to go back and read. The man's name here, Sergius Paulus. They're going to Paul in Acts 13. Paul and Barnabas are invited to go by the governor of Cyprus, and that is Sergius Paulus, to present their message to him. An inscription found on Cyprus and dating from the mid-1st century mentions a Paulus who was proconsul there. So after Paul's word came true that the Lord would strike the false prophet Bar Jesus or Elymas, Sergius Paulus believed. Notice there, verse 12. Then the deputy, and that's Sergius Paulus, when he saw what was done, believed, being astonished at the doctrine of the Lord. Now, Mr. Bale, in his book, he says there, because that word believed, he says, should be a word of caution should be pointed here. He says, the term which Luke uses to mean believe may not imply a full conversion. It could merely, now notice what it says, it could merely suggest that Paulus was impressed by the displays of this new little g God's power. But the problem that we would have is if we were to turn back to Acts chapter 8, we can make the connection. There's a man by the name of Simon, chapter 8, verse 13. It says there, and then Simon himself believed. That's the same identical word in the same tense and everything. The word believe stands there, part split for the whole, the synecdoche. That means he obeyed the gospel. And the same would be true, it would seem to me, with that of Sergius Paulus. It's the same word that's found in James chapter 2 and verse 23, where it says, and the scriptures were fulfilled, which saith Abraham believed God. Now, what did Abraham do when he believed God? He obeyed it. And so it would seem that this man, Sergius Paulus, had obeyed the gospel of Christ. Now, we don't mention him as a conversion. There are sometimes I heard a preacher one time, I didn't see his sermon, but he was preaching on the lesser conversions and the other conversions in the New Testament book of Acts. And that would have been one of mine, Sergius Paulus. And I would talk more about that word believe because of the way that it's used. But the proconsuls were automatically members of the Synod. Okay? So when this man returned to Rome, there was at least one person in that body, and Mr. Bell says, if not a full-fledged Christian, at least had some first-hand experience with movement. So a bit of indirect evidence from full conversion of Sergius Paulus is the later existence of a house church around 100 AD in the home of a Roman man named Sergia Paulinia. Note that the literature on this subject is in English. In other words, the note that they have, or none of this literature on the subject is in English. So there's a difference in the spelling, but it seems like it's a home church. In other words, they met in his home because they didn't have a building meeting. And that's what they did in the first century. So since that point in the narrative of Acts that Saul's name is changed also, some people have come along and go back to the 5th century BC, 5th century AD, Jerome, had thought that he took that name in honor of this first Jewish convert, Saul, for a number of reasons, and that explanation appears unlikely, to mention only one objection, that an individual's name would have been changed in that manner only if he were a slave being emancipated and taken on his former master's family name. In the case of Felix, who we're going to talk about, or if a man was being adopted, in the case of Gallio, we're going to talk about. But Paul was a Roman citizen from birth, so some other explanation of his change of name must be sought. Origen, in the mid-3rd century, noted that the name change in Scripture are always divine origin and results from some like religious or life-changing event like Jacob and Israel or Simon Peter. Well, the same could be true here, but it may not be. You see, Origen concluded that Paul, and I would conclude also that Paul had a double name, and as did many Romans and of the non-Italian background. John Mark, Acts 16, verse 37 for one. So this Saul was his Jewish name and Paul was his Roman name. We know him, Acts chapter 8, as Saul. And then we understand, because he's preaching and teaching the gospel, that all of a sudden he's called Paul. Why? Because he goes to the Romans, the Gentiles. Now, then there's another possibility, is that the Hebrew name Saulus closely resembles a Greek word which some unfortunate connotations, and so they changed his name. So. Then you have Gallio and Seneca. Turn over to Acts chapter 18, verse 12 through 17. He begins in verse 12. He says, and when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, now Achaia is Corinth, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. Now that would be the Mosaic law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye into it. For I will be no judge of such matters. And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of those things. Now, he was born, that is Gallio, was born Lucius Annaeus Novatus. And brother of the philosopher L. Ananias Seneca. Nero's tutor. Okay. Now, childish aristocrats would sometimes adopt one of the children if of their more prolific friends to ensure the survivor of their own family name. So Novatus was one of the three brothers that was adopted by L. Junius Galileo, taking his name and becoming, in every legal sense of the word, his son. Now, that's according to Roman law. Now, under Roman law, such adoptions were irreversible, even if all the remaining children of the biological family were to die unexpectedly. Now, there's a thing in the book, it's called The God Within Us, and I quote, let me tell you who it's from. It's from Seneca. Seneca wrote this. He says, we need not lift our hands to heaven or beg the keeper of a temple to allow us to close to the ear of the idol, as though we could be better heard in that way. God is near you, with you, inside of you. A Holy Spirit, small h and s, dwells within us, who notices our deeds, good and bad, and is our guardian. As we treat this Spirit, so he treats us. Truly, no one is good without God, little g. Can anyone rise above fortune unless he is aided by God, little g? If he will give a grand and upright counsel, as Virgil said, an unknown God dwells in each good man, he said. So Gallio was counseled at an unknown date and then began proconsul of Achaia, that is Lower Greece, in AD 52. That's an updated date. And a couple of inscriptions have been found in in archaeology, confirming that he had held that office, and although they do not establish the year precisely. But his tribunal in Corinth has been excavated, and Gallio's refusal to hear charges against Paul, Acts 18 verses 14 and 15, conforms to the policy of Rome at that time. The Roman bureaucrats had tried to leave as much as this local governance as possible. They did not want to get involved with those types of things. It was local. You take care of it. And if you can't take care of it, we'll get somebody that will. That was the other things that being said. So they were reluctant, really, to get involved in internal affairs of any local, notice this now, cult, as long as they posed no threat to the general social order. So they did attempt to stop the worshipers, Bacchus, of Isis in Rome itself because of the disruption of the character of all their festivities. But such measures were at a last resort. I mean, that was the last thing they wanted to do. So Galileo says to them, he says, see it to yourself. And that was the most typical response that was given by the Romans. The imagination of some of the Christians had run rampant in trying to explain why Gallio referred to refuse to hear the charges against Paul. And some of them have suggested that perhaps he already knew Paul and secretly sided with him. Well, stop for a moment and think. If he knew Paul was a Roman citizen, he was a smart man doing what he did. So the connection might have been, though, through his brother Seneca, whose humane Stoic philosophy is close to the Christian ethic at many points. Now, you'll find later that Paul quotes from the Stoic philosopher. Okay? A body of forged correspondence, the letters of Seneca and Paul, was composed in the 4th century borrowing phrases from the actual letters of Paul and also the works of Seneca, and apparently someone, perhaps acting on Paul's behalf, reference to the Christians among those of the emperor's household, Philippians 4, verse 22. Now, that they created these letters to suggest that Seneca had been a closet Christian. Tertullian, another historian, held that opinion in the late 2nd century, and Jerome did in 400. J.B. Lightfoot pointed out a number of parallels between the thoughts of Paul and Seneca in his commentary on Philippians. But Seneca talks about God dwelling in man, about a Holy Spirit. But Lightfield goes on and he concludes in his work in reference to that the source of Seneca's thought is not Paul, but early Stoicism. Now, again, Paul will quote the Stoics because what they said was correct. So we do understand some of the things that the Stoic people, the Stoic philosophers, the philosophers who were Stoic, were true. Now there is more in reference. The nephew of Seneca and Gallio, the poet Lucian, bears that name, Lucan, pertaining to Luke. So Lucas is a common name. Lucian is also known, but Lucan is apparently unique. So could it have been in honor of the physician Luke, who maybe was the doctor at his birth? Now, that's what they say. But we have to, if that's the case, then they had midwives for births. And no doctor would actually do that, so that would be not normal for them to do it. The ancient doctors little knew about gynecology. And as the poor women in the Gospels who had been bleeding for 12 years would probably testify to that in Mark chapter 5, verse 5. They didn't know much. So this highly placed family, the Aeneas, came to grief in AD 65. Seneca, by their shut it aside by that of Nero, was implicated in a plot to kill the emperor. And so in good old Roman fashion, he was allowed to commit suicide rather than suffer the degrading of execution, cruelty of the Roman penal system. Now Gallio and Lucian, not Lucian is the other, also suspected of being in the plot, killed themselves as well. Now, in his life of Lucan, Suetonius reports that the poet tried to implicate his mother in the plot in order to save himself. So you can see what they try to do when they get caught up. We see some of that today, and even in our society, they won't blame everybody else. And so there might seem to be several connections between Paul and the family of Seneca. But when we examine the evidence thoroughly, it has no substance. Galileo acted as any Roman governor of a province would have in Paul's case. Seneca's humanistic philosophy is representing a finer side of Roman thought, often overlooked because of the orgies and the bloody games that they played in the arenas, and the oddity of Lucan's name may have been a perfectly reasonable explanation, which had been lost to us like so much other things. But we have no evidence connecting Luke with Seneca's family in any way. There's no evidence whatsoever. And so they're just simply, as we would say, stories. They don't offer up anything. The stories that have grown up around this family and their supposed connection to Christianity arose out of understandable impulse. Even early Christians wanted to know much as possible that they could about their own origins. Just like, we like to know all about our genealogy. So they were people accustomed to explaining things with stories. Stories. And they made big stories. Lying stories. But the same process of exhortation can be seen at work in the stories of wise men who honored Jesus at his birth. So all of this should be a lesson in this. And this is what Mr. Bale says. And I thought this was good. Now I'm going to read the whole paragraph and we'll stop. He says, all this should be a lesson to us in evaluating evidence. We cannot make the evidence say what we want it to if that is not its natural meaning. Nor can we manufacture material to fill the gaps created by the loss of documents or the silence on certain points in those documents which survive. Reasonable deductions can sometimes be made at points where the evidence is incomplete or ambiguous. We must remember, however, that they are only conjectures and not use them as though they were sound evidence to build a future case or further case as occasionally happens. It's better to live honestly with uncertainty than to create some imposing edifice of interpretation which rests only on the sandy foundation of supposition. And I think he's got a good point. Some people do that with archaeology. It's amazing to find things in archaeology. Okay, 7:28. We'll take a 10-minute break, come back. I'm going to let this run, so y'all watch what you say. Don't be talking behind the teacher's back. Okay.
Who was the name of the, there was a historian or a writer that corroborated some of the stuff with Luke? That was a while. It was 30 months ago. I don't remember what we were talking about.
What did it start with? Did you start trying to spell it?
It wasn't Cindy, was it?
Let me go back here.
I just remember you said that it sort of went along with Luke and I don't remember what his name was.
So many of those spells. Let's see here. Oh, I think trying to pronounce them.
Well,
I looked some of them up, and I just
saw about a couple months ago now.
Tacitus?
Yeah, was that his name?
Tacitus. 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 Yeah, I used to call him Tackius, and somebody said his name's not Tackius. I was like, he's tacky to me.
Okay, I got you. Yeah, well, they found Pontius Pilate's one of his signet rings, and they an article I read the letters for the inscription. It looked a lot more like Pontius Pilate, and he's actually got a U.S. on the end, which I guess makes sense in the context of everybody else's name at that time.
Yeah.
So,
Well, see, even if you say, for instance, if they spell his name like in the Greek, say it was what you said, Pilate.
it looked, yeah, Pilatus. Instead of an E on the end, it had a U.S.
We'll just say, I don't know if this is the way you spell P-A-T, Pilate. P-L-A-T-E. Well, see, in the Greek, say if he was said Pilate went to town, that would say correct. But if it's in the sentence somewhere and say this has been dropped and this has been put there, see it could mean it's in the prepositional phrase of the man Pilate or of Pilate. So because of that ending there, it's just the Greek ending.
Okay.
For the nouns, they have wherever they may be, whether they be in the nominative or whatever. And so that's how a lot of people, if they're reading, you have to make sure that if you're reading those manuscripts, if you can read those manuscripts.
Someone else is frustrated. Do you is there like half the names you're pronouncing? I realize I've been pronouncing for years.
Well, just like Corey Bonnet, Chuck Richard's card said, he said, nobody here knows how to pronounce it because they weren't back there when they were pronounced, therefore you get called out the name. That's my pronunciation.
Okay, don't feel so bad now. at home last week?
Hmm?
Were you at home last week?
Oh, no, well, I wasn't, I gone.
We have one other guy who is here, who's not here right now.
He's online. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Eric, you are on first.
I've learned not to pronounce names from now on. I'm gonna call everyone, hey, you.
I was a little tired last week because I'd gotten up early that day and we moved the steeple off of our church.
Oh.
So,
Okay, remind me, when we get back on that, I'll say something about those who take the fit, things you have to do.
oh, yeah, okay.
We got others on the here too. Things are changing because we're going on that semester thing. Like in this class, is that we don't have, I don't have notes. We used to put things like you come twice, if it's training, and I have to see notes. I see you don't have to see two. Since you weren't here last week, you have to watch the video
Okay.
and send them.
So now, so if I'm here, I don't send them to you, I'm just, okay, but if I do it over the internet, I'm gonna- okay.
I was, but.
You go there?
It died.
I'm sorry.
Well, I got a page worth. I pretty much like took down important names and I'm going to look them up later.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, like I said earlier, when we were talking, that I wished I had a class like this and even biblical archaeology before. We had geography, biblical geography at Memphis School of Preaching. And all through my undergraduate and graduate studies, and even in my doctoral studies, I never studied either of those two. I mean, there was reference to them, but I never did have just a study. This right here is it's just something else. Sit down and read and getting, as we call it, the background information. You know, when we were studying Thessalonians at Cartersville, and so when, you know, I just don't say 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 1 and we start talking. What I do, I go back to Acts chapter 17. That's where the church started, and that's background. Well, you know, here's a lot of background information. I'm talking about a lot. And I'll be using my books, and I love books like these. It's all about trying to get this book. This book and this and Brother Ferguson's book, they have a passage, biblical passages in the back, so you look at the page, or they use them and refer to them. You're talking about.
That's so cool.
It is, and it helps you so much when you say, for instance, if you want to look, say, well, I want to talk about the Apostle Paul's conversion. You look in that book, you know, it's right there.
It's definitely nice to get the historical context.
Yes.
So it makes it a little more sense.
We had a graduate class, and not as David about to tell me talk here. It's called the historical background. I guess it's called historical background. But it's on the Old Testament. Brother Rex Turner taught the class with his material, and we got in there, and he didn't give us a syllable. He didn't give us anything. He started on the third week. He finally defined historical perspective. And he had written a lot of it, and I had all his writings. I didn't make them. I just, he had a lesson commentary page for it. And I got my grade on my notebook. He wrote a note of it. He supposed to make notes. So I went to him. I said, why should I make notes? I said, you read it right out on the commentary. And I said, I got the commentary. I got it marked up. And he said, well, I wanted you to make notes for future reference. I said, that's right. I have the book. You know, and then I criticized him because he wanted to criticize. He said, I want to criticize about the thought. I criticized him. I said, you waited 3 weeks before you even told us what you want to do. And it's a great course. I told him, I said, it's a great course. I said, you know, just to listen to what he had to say and all the background stuff he knew. It was all, man, it's something else. You know, but see, he'd always taught us, like, you can take methods and things like that as reference to if you got to do things, but he didn't do well.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a B in that course. And all the other fellas praised him, slapped him on the back, and he got called that A. I told him, I said, yeah, I said, y'all stand on the day of judgment. Every one of them. When they gripe and complain, they go eat at Western City. They gripe and complain. Why they go eat it? I love Brother Turner. I mean, I walk by if he walking down the hallway. Hey, brother, we talk. I guess because I was just up front with him. Okay. Well,
You were in the Army?
yes, sir. You're in the Marine Corps. You were.
The
Uncle Sam's misguided children.
real military?
Real military. That's what we let y'all think that.
Yeah.
Well, now was y'all before the Navy or was the Navy first? Aren't
No,
y'all a department of the Navy?
chicken for the egg and for-
Aren't y'all part of the Navy?
Yeah, they still fix that.
Yeah, they need to be. They always told me they got y'all. So I mean, they got y'all because they'd have somebody to dance with when they had a party. We have a lot of fun. We have our Vietnam veterans group, and we're all mixed up. So we have a lot of fun. But you can't let anybody that outside that wasn't in the military get in on fun. Boy, it makes people mad. Why are you talking about a Marine like that? Oh, you shouldn't talk about an Army fellow like that. Well, they always, the Marine people always call us wannabes. I said, I don't want to be one. I volunteered for I volunteered for the draft, and they took me. And I volunteered in Vietnam, and they sent me. So
Volunteered for the nice equipment and the hot food.
Well, I should have gone into the Air Force. What I should have done.
Yeah.
I got out. I took all the tests in high school, 1966. They wanted me to go in as a airplane mechanic, and I said that's 4 years. I can take 4 years. So I was thinking about it. Then graduation came around. I met my wife to be
You in
2 years. So
2 years?
I was in Vietnam for a year. That counted as extra year for benefits.
Okay.
You ever watched the movie Platoon?
I have.
That's my unit. That's what I was.
Okay. Right.
We had a rough time. We lost a lot of folks. I was in infantry.
Yeah, that's where I started, and then I ended up in mortuary.
Okay, it's time to start back. Is it recording? Hey, I know his thumb comes up with Jim because his mouth's full. Oh, brought my apple. Okay, listen, those of you who are taking this for credit, you have to remember, since you're streaming out there, that I have to have a copy of your notes of the class. Now we're using the book. The notes that you get from me are from the book. It's a copy of the book. And then the other information was just stuff that I pick up, but the test will be on things in the book. It won't be anything that we've talked about, that questions have been asked. But you have to send me copies of your notes so that I know that you attended the class. And those of you who attend class and then maybe you missed, then you have to do the very same thing. You have to show me your notes. You have to send me a copy of them. And you can send them to them on my email address, just let me. And I'll look at those. And then you'll have 2 tests. You'll have a midterm test, which is coming up sometime this coming month. And then you'll have a final test. And if you keep up with your notes, that means that when I give you the test and you show me you've done all the notes, that means that I can grade your paper and give you a grade and send it to the school right quick, and then we're through. Until I see all your notes, you don't get a grade, okay? And because I have to know you've attended. You have to attend if you miss. Right now, if you miss over 3 classes, then but they're going to change that, I understand. So I'd say that. So if you miss 3 classes, don't think if you're going for credit, thinking that you will. Basically, if you're going for credit, you can't miss 3 classes because you got to do you got the videos. If you was in class and there was no streaming, then I think they're going to change that. But any questions? No questions. I done lost one of my students. Yeah. Oh well. Okay, we got down now. We talked about Felix. No, we didn't. See, I moved my thing looking for your thing. Okay, Felix is the next person we're going to talk about. We was talking about Gallio, then Festus, right? We talked about Gallio.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Felix is next. I moved it a while ago because you was asking me about Tacitus. The next highly placed Roman official, now again, we're spending a lot of time because we have the time to talk about these, is that these are the people that we meet actually in the book of Acts more than anything else. And they have dates surrounding them that's been proven and because of archaeology and other things that they found. And so Felix was the governor of Judea. Now remember again, the idea about Judea, if things didn't go well, they changed. So he was the governor of Judea from about 53 to 60 AD. AD 53 to 60 AD. And so if we're looking for possible links between the Christians and the Roman hierarchy, we can note that Felix is described, according to Acts 24 and verse 22, rather well informed about the way. And you'll find in some versions of the Bible, the word way is capitalized and some not. My Dixon Bible does not capitalize it. But he's talking about the way, and when we talk about the way, we're talking about John 14, verse 6. Now, he was a former slave of Antonia, mother of the Emperor Claudius. And he took the name Marcus Antonius Felix, or perhaps Marcus Claudius Felix. There's some discrepancy there, but we know he was Felix. And when he was freed, he rose in a social standing, and he married Drusilla, who was the sister of King Herod Agrippa II. And his brother Paulus, Paulus, P-A-L-L-A-S, Paulus, was one of the Claudius's closest advisors and remained even with that of Nero's reign until around the year 60. And so Felix's knowledge of the way is intriguing in light of Nero's use of Christians as a scapegoat, if you remember when Rome burned in AD 64. Most of the scholars have actually felt that Nero had no knowledge of the Christians before he began casting around for someone who would fix the blame. But if Felix knew a good deal about them and if someone on whom to fix the blame, we would find that Felix's brother Paulus had been close to Nero for so many years. So, again, remember what we read about what Mr. Bell said about speculation. It is mere speculation to suggest that the emperor had received some information about the Christians. Judea was a trouble spot for the Romans. And Nero, no doubt, received regular briefings on situations that were there. And just like all the others before him, he had his run-ins with that other Christian people. Not only the Christian people, but the Jewish people. But they all looked upon these different groups as Jewish people, just different groups. But the Christian people that he come to know about, Felix may be the man that when he heard Paul preach, he was frightened, if you recall. He trembled, and he sent him away. But we shouldn't read too much even into that. He was also hoping for a bride, if you recall. When you read Acts 24, 25, and 26, Felix thought that Paul should give him money. Now, Tacitus describes Felix as sampling every kind of cruelty and lust, exercising the king's power with a slave's heart. So Felix was removed from office in AD 60, and probably as a part of the purge which Nero undertook after murdering his mother to rid himself of persons such as Seneca and Paulus, whom she had put into positions of power. Then that brings us to a man by the name of Festus. I want to stop for a moment because I want to look at my book again to see if I underscored anything about this man, Felix, in my other book. I write down the things, and then I don't write down that if I underscored something or another. There's about 10 pages talking about him. So we won't talk about him from the Ferguson's book. We will go to Ferguson's book, and they'll become brought back up with all in one. Then you have the man Festus, and Festus he was the successor to, or he came into power after that of Felix, and his name was Porcius Festus, and he served only 2 years before dying in office. But Josephus praised his efforts, actually to try to put down the terrorists. You remember those terrorists that would go through the crowd with the knives and they'd be covered up and they'd stab people? Well, he tried to get rid of those. And he found himself faced with a case left over from the previous administration with that of Paul, which he really wanted to clear that up, wanted to get through it very quickly. If you go over to Acts 25 and verse 9, 25:9 of the book of Acts, the Bible says, "But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me?" So he wanted to get that. Seems as if that he really wanted to get this thing settled in reference to that of the Apostle Paul. Paul was astute enough to know how that would turn out. So he says no, he basically didn't want to go there. He appealed to Caesar, which was a right, which we'll talk about, reserved to Roman citizens, as we're going to look at. And maybe something out if we get that far. Whatever would happen to the prisoner in Rome, Festus was probably relieved by Paul's appeal, for it took the responsibility for that case off of the prefect and passed it on to the higher authority. And so the workings of the bureaucracies have changed a little over the centuries, but yet we find that when we look at Paul, that actually they worked, because when he said he wanted to go see Caesar, then that's what happened to him, and that was the fulfillment of the law, of the Roman law. And another thing about that is that then we have to understand, well, what happened to Paul when he gets to the Roman prison? And we'll talk bring up again in reference to some of the Roman laws about people that are in prison. And we do know, because what the Bible says, that Paul had his own hired house. And to have his own hired house, that simply meant that he had to have support from somewhere. And so Christians were supporting him, and so that he could have his own hired house. And many people were coming and going there, and he was writing and sending things out. There are some other characters that we find in the New Testament. There's one called, and if you want to look over to Luke 2 and verse 2, it's the census. And in Luke, he says, "And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria." Now, Cyrenius is found there, but one of the names that's one of the difficulties is a man by the name of Quirinius. Quirinius, I guess is the way you would say it. See, and some people try to mix him up with Luke 2:2, and so because he was governor, Cyrenius was governor of Syria when Jesus was born, but we would find that this Quirinius' governorship associated with the census of Judah that is mentioned can be firmly dated from the Roman sources to be about AD 6. And so that was a year that Archelaus was removed from the kingship of Judea, and the area became a Roman province. And so Quirinius then supervised the taking of the census with the imposition of new taxes. And that's what's triggered a revolt that was led by Judas the Galilean in Acts chapter 5 and verse 37, where he's mentioned. Now, the relationship of that census to the registration recorded in Luke has been a matter of dispute for a number of years. But the question revolves around how Luke, now again, remember, we believe that Luke writes by inspiration. Now, Mr. Bale seems like he does not believe that. But anyway, this question revolves around Luke, so accurate in most details, could make some mistake in some chronology, he says. Now, I don't understand that. Again, I don't understand, maybe we have the correct information for all things. But if he was writing for a Roman official, the pseudo Theophilus, God lover, he would have to be careful with his facts. And so some scholars have tried to say, in reference to that, to discover some type of earlier governorship for Quirinius, but the names of the governors of Syria, 9 to 4 BC, when Jesus was most likely born, are known from inscription. So the governor of 6 BC was a man by the name of Sentius and Saturnus, mentioned by Tertullian, and as one under the whom Jesus' birth occurred. One possibility is confusion between Quirinius and a Cuticulus Barnus, governor of Syria between 9 and 6 BC. Around 5 or 4 BC is when Quirinius conducted the campaigns in the Tarsus Mountains against a rebellious tribe. And so all these things were taking place. So it has been suggested, Mr. Bell says, that Luke erroneously attached the name of the Roman official responsible for the latter, much more notorious sentence. And so, but we believe that Luke wrote by inspiration. So it seems that there is confusion, and it is confusion. But in one of the passages of a Christian historian called Eusebius, he actually admits that there is a contradiction in the names between the two sources, or two of his sources. And he concludes that either the name has been changed by some scribal mistake, or that two names for the same man, as often happens. And so we've already seen that to be true. And so another possible explanation is that the Greek phrase which Luke uses should be translated for Quirinius was governor of Syria. And it is admittedly not the most natural translation, but it's the standard translation of the Greek dictionaries. And so Josephus does mention that Herod required that all his subjects take an oath of allegiance to Augustus in 7 BC, sometimes which client kings or governors occasionally did to impress the emperor with that of loyalty. And so we must remember that he begins his birth narrative, as Luke does, in the days of Herod, king of Judah, and so Judea. And so whatever registration Luke had in his mind must have taken place before 4 BC when Herod died. So again, Luke was guided by the Holy Spirit to write Luke and the book of Acts. So Augustus, Caesar, took several censuses during the 8 and 4 BC, but that was not covered, that would not have covered Judea, as we would call it, a client kingdom and not part of the Roman Empire at that time. So he would not cover Judea. So it's possible that Luke's writings, 70 or more years later, could not distinguish between Augustus and Herod's registration. Now again, that's a thought that would tell us that Mr. Bell does not believe that Luke was writing by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So there seems to be a debate to how to reach what one scholar calls a condition of agnostic stalemate. So I guess that's why we just don't know. But they spend a lot of time, or he does spend a lot of time there. Also, then the next people we come up with are the soldiers. Now, several minor figures in the New Testament are soldiers. We know the centurion, Cornelius, Acts chapter 10. Became a convert, but we know nothing else about him except what's in Acts 10 and 11. Not even Eusebius, who rarely passes up a good story and has all those apocryphal tales about him. The triune of Claudius Lysias, Acts 23, verse 26, who found nothing blameworthy in Paul, is otherwise unknown to us. And so the nameless centurion who stood by the cross is an example of an individual baptized by the early Christians because they felt that such a person must believe in Christ, even if the New Testament does not specifically say so. Now, such testimonies were considered important evidence in the Christian dispute with the pagans. The centurion becomes a man by the name of Longinus, or long spear. Okay? Now, Brother Ferguson, in his book, mentions this twice, and I'm going to read that. I hope I'm going to read that. He calls him the pseudo Longinus. And there, and also in another place, he mentions him. And again, he basically points out to us the very same thing in reference to him. And the point being, as we stop and we think, we really don't know his name, it seems. But those are 3rd century stories that we hear, but we do know something about him. And when we read the context of Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke chapter 23, we do come away with something about him, because he was awestruck for the admiration for Christ, who was understood as a profession of faith. That is simply saying that when you sit down and read the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it appears in somewhat versions of, as we would say, those 3, but it does not appear in that of John at all. If you had the book of Mr. Bale, you could go to chapter 10, and I put the notes in my notes. And he says this about this. He says in Matthew 27:54 and Mark 15:39, the centurion's reaction to the crucifixion was, truly, this was the Son of God. That's the King James American. The New Revised Standard Version says, or this truly was God's Son. At least that's the way it's usually taken. But the Greek text doesn't contain the article, the. The New Revised Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version, in notes conceded that the quality valid translation would be a Son of God. Well, it's amazing to me, and I like to study Greek, and it's amazing to me that these same people in the NRSV and RSV, that they will put something like that, and they'll turn right around, and they'll find phrases, reference to the Holy Spirit, and they'll put the word "thee" there, and there is no "thee" there. But the thing is that it talks about him being the Son of God. The word "a" is not in the language. It would just simply, truly, this was Son of God. You don't have to have no "a." Just like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Jehovah's Witness, say was a God. No, it doesn't say a God. There's no indefinite article. There's no definite article. It says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And so, and they also try to say a God to make it show that Jesus is inferior to, that is, from the Heavenly Father. But the early Christian writer Justin Martyr recognized that subtle difference with the articles in his sentence can make. Now, the Son of God called Jesus, even if he was only a man born in the ordinary way, because of his wisdoms, desires to be called a Son of God. So in that age, when the divine and human were believed to mingle much more easily than we can see, such a statement probably meant no more than this, and as a godly man, terms one might apply to others. But the thing of it is that no doubt many believers later took his explanation as believing that this centurion believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He had come to believe because of what he saw, the evidence that was there. So another problem arises, though, from the fact that Luke 23 and verse 47 records the centurion saying, certainly this man was innocent. So the skeptic can point to that inconsistency and claim that we cannot trust the gospel account. And I put a note in my notes. Luke was guided by the Holy Spirit to write Luke and Acts. And so, so some of those fellows, they write, we found this to be true when we studied the introduction to the New Testament, that the book that we were using, those people did not believe in verbal inspiration. And they have a good book, but they didn't believe in verbal inspiration. So we can recognize that Luke's purpose differs from Matthew's and Mark's, but both of those gospels seem to have been writing primarily for internal consumption, he says, for readers who are already Christians. Well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was written after the gospel had been preached. Basically, it had been preached in oral form to everybody that was able to hear, and then the Gospel of Matthew was probably the first gospel that was written. And so Luke was writing in an effort to legitimize the church in the eyes of the Romans. That's what he said. If a nonsense person like the centurion, the backbone of the army, the dust of the empire, could see that Jesus was innocent of any offense against Rome, then surely it must be evident to everyone. That's his point. So we find Luke has the Roman governor, prefect Pilate, clearly state 3 times that Jesus is innocent. Chapter 23, verse 4, verse 14, and verse 22, rather than merely raising the question, what evil has done, Matthew 27 and verse 23, and Mark chapter 15 and verse 14. So it seems as if that this centurion come to believe, he believed that he was innocent, but he says truly he was the Son of God. I didn't look to see, and where's my phone? Oh, I didn't look to see. Let me look at something right quick on my phone. And because the majority text has been updated, and let's see here if I can read Luke 23, 47. No, 47. Luke 23, that was 47. Luke 23, 46. Let's see if the majority text has, there's a variant there. Luke 23. Well, he says this man was a righteous man, so the Greek text is the D is not there in verse 47. What was the other verse that we were looking at there? Let me go back there. Oh, okay. Matthew, right? Matthew 27, is that right? 27:54. Let's see. 24, 54. 54. Now the centurion, this one truly was the Son of God. Now that's the modern literal version, and they follow the majority. If y'all let me lose you just for a minute, we'll see. Matthew 27:54. Matthew 27:54. Matthew 27:54. Okay, it's not in the majority text either, so the word "the" is not. Okay, the next person is Theophilus. Everybody knows about Theophilus? God lover. There's a lot of times when we, I guess, we do the study of the book of Luke, that we talk some more so about this idea was actually Theophilus. Was Theophilus a real person? Or was it some type of office that someone held? If that be the case, it'd be a real person. But he points out it does not appear as a character of the New Testament in the New Testament narrative. The person to whom Luke was writing ought to be mentioned briefly. He is identified only by Theophilus, and that word means God lover. And so he says that this is a title and not as a name. Now, again, that has been discussed by others. Sometimes such a title could be self-designation. Ignatius, an early second century bishop and martyr, refers to him in the opening of his letter to the Ephesians as Ignatius, who is also called Theophorus, that is God-bearer. And so who was he? Well, he is called in Luke chapter 1 and verse 3, when you read, he is called the most excellent. So we're probably safe in thinking that he's talking about a Roman official. Now, I don't know who that would be, but the Greek word there that is used is typical address to a person that's in authority. God lover indicates that he was at least an inquirer, if not a member of the Christian fellowship. But some of the scholars argue that he might have been a hostile Roman official. Beyond that, we cannot go, though this has not prevented speculation. So it's been suggested that it may have been the Flavius, that is Clemens, a cousin of the Emperor Domitian, because of his interest that they know about, according to the writings of Christianity. Not of Christianity, but his interest in that of Judaism. But again, there's nothing to connect him with Christianity. So it would actually depend upon, and this is another thing that we would find out in the Introduction to the New Testament, the dates of Luke and Acts. Yeah, it's my contention that they were written in 62 and 63. So it might be possible to suggest that Sergius Paulus was the person to whom the work was dedicated, but there are too many unknowns, and so we cannot solve it. So I don't know why he even, Mr. Bill even mentions it, but he does. Then we come another person, Dionysius. The Arabic, we might wonder about the reliability of ancient historical resources when we see the confusion arises around some of these names. But Diocese is one of these figures. His conversion by Paul is mentioned in Acts 17, verse 34, along with a woman named Damaris and some others. And his title means that he was a member of the Areopagus, the aristocratic supreme court of the ancient Athens, and thus a person of some stature in the city. It even is suggested by the late 2nd century that he was reckoned as the first bishop of the church at Corinth. Now, though he was sometimes confused with the later bishop of the same name. Now, again, that's according to the way that they look at things when you talk about bishops, if they have that Catholicism behind them. But he is confused with another man with the same name around 250 that was a missionary to the Gauls. But his name was also attached to some mystical writings around the 6th century. So basically, we don't know. And then there are others. That's the way Mr. Bell puts it, others. And there is a passage in in Romans chapter 16. And he mentions this man in Romans chapter 16 and verse 23. Gaius, my host, and of the whole church salute you. Then he mentions Erastus, the chamberlain of the city, saluteth you, and Quartus, a brother. Sometimes it's good to sit down and read some of those names in the latter parts of some of the books. But he mentions Erastus here, and he's of Corinth, and Brother Ferguson mentions that also on page 41 and 29. Now, in an inscription that has been found at Corinth, which says that a man by the name of Erastus, holding the office of Adia, that's the same thing as being a chamberlain, a treasurer, paid to pave a portion of a street. So he was obviously then the person who was some wealth and standard community. But is he the one that Paul is talking about? Is Paul really saying that Erastus is a Christian? And I have no problem when I read, he talks about these people at the end of these books, because he talks about, he puts him in there with some people that we can go all the way back. Go back to verse 21. He says, Timothy, my work fellow, Lucius and Jason and Sosipater, my kinsman, salute you. I, Terius, who wrote this epistle, salute you in the Lord. Gaius, my host, and the whole church saluteth you. Erastus, the chamberlain of the city. Why would he be saluting them? He's writing to the church at Rome. Why would he be saluting them if he doesn't have any connection or fellowship with them? You know. So when you look there, and this idea that he might be, seems to me that he is. There are some later generation Christians that were not satisfied to leave some persons referred to in the New Testament without names. Traditions arose around the names of the 72 disciples sent out by Jesus in Luke chapter 10, about the name of the shepherds who came to see Jesus at birth, Luke chapter 2. Somewhere in Mr. Bale's book here, he names those three men, but we're not concerned about that, or about characters such as the Philippian jailer. Who was he? I don't know who he was. There are minor players, such as the bridegroom at the wedding in Canaan, for whom Jesus created an extra supply of wine, or Mary's mother, were given names. The stories were passed by down through the centuries, and yet there are many more. The Magi of Matthew's Nativity, Matthew chapter 2. The nativity scenes were painted, shown in mosaics, and it was natural to depict one man holding the gold, another man frankincense, another third man myrrh. Therefore, there's three of them. Well, the bad problem is that all three of those words, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, are in the plural. So it's a plurality of that, not just one piece of it. So it might have been more than that. But like I said, they name them somewhere along the line. Bethsar, Melchior, and Gaspar were the name of the Magi. I don't know if they were or not. The number 3 was also thought to be symbolized of 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Okay? 3 Magi's are shown as men, approximately 20, 40, and 60 to cover all the stages of human life. So names. Names were never created for some important figures in the New Testament. Acts refers to several of those. Not a few of the leading women. He talks about in Romans 16 and verse 7, he talks about Judah, who may have been a man. Some say he's a woman. Some say it was a woman, a name for a woman, and some says it's a name for a man. It's just according to what you read, according to the copyists. Acts chapter 19:31. Some of the Asiarchs of the province of Asia, modern Western Turkey, persuaded Paul not to try to address the crowd of irate worshippers, the Atrameus. The Asiarchs were a council of the wealthiest men in the province, who oversaw public work programs such as building buildings and roads and games or shows, and they are not described as Christians, but as friendly to Paul. But they're unknown. And on you could go with a number of those different ones. The thing is, he ends his, on this chapter, he ends this. He says, from even this quick survey, we can see that persons of all social ranks were interested in Christianity. It has been fashionable among scholars to assume that the early church consisted of slaves and free men. Now, Edward Gibbon, y'all know who Edward Gibbon is? He wrote 2 big old thick books on the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. I paid about $20 for those just to get one phrase in reference to Domitian. And so, but Edward Gibbon, in the late 18th century, called the dregs of the populace. That's what he called it. Gathering in their occasional free hours to worship. But even allowing for a tendency to promote their own cause, the writers of the New Testament clearly showed another picture. And so individuals, I don't know if Edward Gibbons read the New Testament or not, but individuals, even the highest ranks, were familiar with Christianity. And if we can accept that Sergius Paulus was converted, even became adherents of the new faith, working against a powerfully efficient political system that controlled every aspect of subject's life. Christianity spread both laterally across the empire and vertically to all social classes more rapidly than had generally been recognized, though some have still argued for the old view of other modern scholars have begun to see the church of the first century in new light socially. And so we would find, Paul tells us in Colossians 1 that the gospel had been preached throughout all the world. And you sit down and start looking at the number of people that were obeying the gospel, 3,000 on Pentecost, 5,000, and so forth. And as you go through the book of Acts, there's a good sermon that's preached there, the growth of the church. And you will find again that when you look at them, when you think about Cornelius, he was a centurion. He was a high-ranking military man. And so you look at Lydia, she was a very wealthy woman. She was a seller of purple, and purple was a very high-priced commodity. And that's good. When you ever studied that, you go back and look at some archaeological studies in reference to her. But the church in the mid-first century AD faced 2 problems simultaneously. Number one was how to define its relationship with Judaism. Now, that was a big problem. And the problem we would think was kind of solved when the destruction of Jerusalem came in AD 7. But there were still some problems that would come. Not only that, but secondly, to how gain legal standing in the eyes of the Roman government. Now, I don't know what he means by that, but what I think that we find Christ doing when he took the coin and says, whose image is on it, and he says Caesar, and he says, well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. So he made a distinction there in reference to our relationship to government and our relationship to that of the church. And then we find in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 that we are to obey God rather than that of man. So that's our responsibility. We're to do everything that our government tells us to do, as long as it's scriptural in the sense that things that they're telling us to do. But if there are those things that are contrary to that of what God says, then we're to do what God says. And so, but we are to pray for those people that are in government. And Paul says, remember, he spoke against the high priest, and he says, no, you're not supposed to do that. And so there are some things that are given in the Bible that it seems that sometimes many Christians just overlook when they're studying. They ought to study about Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 6. And in 2 Peter or 1 Peter chapter 5 talks about the government also over in Peter. And look at what he tells us, our relationship. We're supposed to be able to pray for them so that we can live a quiet and peaceable life here upon the earth in a godly way. And so we have already looked at the first of all of these, how to define the relationship with Judaism. So now we're going to talk about the Roman government, okay? But that's lesson number 4. Lesson number 4. That's chapter 4 in the book. I call them lessons because I was going to make outlines. And so since we're going to stop, but I want to read some of what Brother Ferguson says, because Brother Ferguson, being a member of the church, some of the things he says. He says, when we talk about Roman law, he says some aspects of it working that are relevant for early Christian history. He points this out. He says the sources of Roman law were the following: laws and statutes enacted by a vote of assembly of the people. The last one was in AD 97. Resolutions of the Senate under the Republic, they lacked the force of law, but from Augustus onward became a means of development of law. Edicts of magistrates, governors, and praetors, which we've already talked about, constitutions of emperors, sayings what must be done, judicial decisions, and lawsuits. Now, I'm going to tell you, next week, we're going to give a case study of law. Okay? Mr. Bale, in his book, gives a case study, and I'm going to read that. But he goes on, he says, response to requests or an embassy, and instructions issued to officials and replies of jurists when consulted. Of course, usage or custom provided an unwritten source of law. Imperial decisions may have died with the emperor who issued them, especially those emanating from emperors whose memory was condemned by the Senate, such as Nero and Domitian, unless they were explicitly renewed by his successor. Since law, however, is built up by precedent, such decisions often serve as guides to judges. During the 2nd century and later, jurists began to collect and organize the laws of judicial decisions and other components of the legal system in a way to guide future officials. Some of these important jurists were Slavish Julianus, the 2nd century, Gaius, the 2nd century, Ulpian, the early 3rd centuries. This activity reached a climax in the great codes of Theodosius and Justinian in the 5th and 6th centuries. Now, reading all that, and if we were to stop just for a moment and say, well, how did our system come to be? It would be the very same way. And it seems as if that we have actually copied some of those, the ways of coming to some laws like the people at Rome did. You know, you just build upon it. Just like today, if the Supreme Court says this is law, well, from now on, it's law. Unless they change it and make it a constitutional law. He goes on, and we'll stop. He says Roman governors of all ranks held the imperium, which gave them almost unlimited power of life and death over their provinces, restricted only by the laws against extortion and treason. Only the holder of the imperium could impose the death sentence, and the governor could not delegate his power. Now, John 18 and verse 31 agrees with this. See page 569. We'll see page 569 right now. Because it brings that same passage up, and he has, let's see what he has to say. I wrote down there a note to see that, so we're going to one more page. The trial of Jesus becomes involved in this dispute. Were the judicial procedures described in the tractate Sanhedrin enforced in the 1st century? It's the question. The proceedings recounted in the Gospels are in flagrant violation of the regulations in the Mishnah. However, those regulations may not have obtained in Jesus' time or may apply to a different court. On the other hand, the Sanhedrin may have been functioning only as a grand jury and not a trial body. The competence of the Sanhedrin to impose the death penalty has also come under consideration. John 18:31 agrees with what is known of Roman law in the province where capital punishment was reserved for the governor. Rome, however, gave a considerable scope to local bodies to administer justice according to local laws. In the case of violators of the temple, for instance, seems to have delegated execution to the local authorities. See, now that's what with Paul, and then he said, I won't go to Caesar. Moreover, there are instances of Jewish leaders executing those found troublemakers. Stephen, Acts 7. These may be cases of taking the law into their own hands, particularly in the absence of a Roman governor. So their laws, when you stop and you look at the laws of that of the Romans, we see how they actually progressed to be the group of laws that they came to be. But yet we have to realize the Jewish people are living amongst that. So are the members of the church, Christian. And so here's the laws of the land that they had to follow as long as it didn't violate the laws of God. And so we will start there, unless you got a question. This was very interesting to me. I mean, I basically had a lot of fun. Let's see. I'm going to put this right here. Let's see. What's next week? February what? Fifth? February the 7th? Yeah, that's right. 7, 14, 21. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to put that date right there so that I'll know that's where I is supposed to start. I think I put that in dark blue, so I'll know blue on blue. Hardly can hardly. Oh, it didn't show up. Blue didn't show up. Yeah, I bet you that right there with it.
Who is that?
Huh?
Is it possible to get,
Do what? Somebody say something?
Who didn't show up?
It didn't show up on mine. The blue did. I'm trying to color something here on my computer. Well, anyway. You'll
I'll
see
see you
it.
Sunday, Bobby.
All right. Y'all have a good night.
Be careful.
Make sure y'all send me those notes if you're taking the credit. All right.
Gotcha.
Good night.